This morning, we're going to discuss the different mechanisms of membrane transport. So last meeting, we discussed about simple diffusion. So simple diffusion is a type of passive diffusion. So when we say passive diffusion or simple diffusion, this is a type of membrane transport mechanism wherein the molecules will be transported from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And this movement or transport of molecules will not require the expenditure of energy. It will also not require the, uh, the presence of transport proteins or membrane proteins. So simple diffusion is a type of passive diffusion. The other type of membrane transport mechanism is the active transport. So we have two major mechanisms whereby molecules are being transported from one part of the membrane to the other, and these are the passive transport and the active transport. So for the simple diffusion, the driving force for the movement of the molecule is the concentration gradient. So when we say concentration gradient, that refers to uh, the concentration of the molecule inside and outside of the cell. So for the simple diffusion, for a molecule to move from an area, the molecule will move from an area of higher to lower concentration. So that is a downhill movement of molecules from higher to lower. Okay. So for simple diffusion, most of the molecules that moves through simple diffusion is the nonpolar molecules. When we say nonpolar molecules, these are molecules that are lipid soluble, so they are hydrophobic, or pa yung other term, nonpolar, hydrophobic, or lipophilic, lipid soluble molecules. So the second mechanism whereby drugs or substances are transported across the membrane is the facilitated diffusion. So in facilitated diffusion, the drug enters through the cell through a specialized transmembrane carrier proteins that facilitate the passage of large molecules. So this drugs will move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So this is true. This is also true for the simple diffusion. The main driving force for the movement of molecule is from area of higher to lower concentration. This type of diffusion does not require energy, and the carriers may be inhibited by compounds that compete for the same carrier. So on the right, we have here a figure showing the mechanism of facilitated diffusion. So the main driving force for facilitated diffusion is the concentration gradient. So from an area of higher to lower concentration, that is the downhill movement of molecules for facilitated diffusion. So in this case, this type of molecules or this type of mechanism requires the presence of protein carriers or transmembrane proteins. So for example, when these molecules will bind to this carrier protein, it will induce the changes in the shape of this particular protein in order to accommodate or to facilitate the entry of these particular molecules from from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane. So an example of a molecule that exhibits facilitated diffusion is the fructose. It is a sugar molecule that requires facilitated diffusion. So a type of facilitated diffusion is a type of diffusion in which the molecules move from an area of higher to lower concentration and is assisted by a carrier. So why do you think that fructose needs a carrier protein in order for it to be transported in the membrane? So ano kaya yung dahilan why yung ating sugar molecule na fructose, it needs a carrier protein in order for it to be transported sa ating membrane. Ano yung dahilan? Why? Any idea from the group? Why does fructose needs a carrier protein in order for it to cross the membrane?
Hydrophilic po sila, sir.
Okay. So tama yun, no? So yung ating sugar molecule, fructose is polar. It is hydrophilic, so it cannot cross the lipid bilayer. So transport proteins it facilitates the transport of polar molecules. So polar molecules, again, cannot pass readily or easily through the cell membrane. They diffuse across the membrane through transport proteins. So they need a carrier protein in order for them to be transported across the membrane. So a transport protein allows certain molecules or ions to diffuse across the membrane. So there are only specific molecules that can be transported by these transport proteins. And one of that molecules are those molecules that are polar. So there are specific molecules that are required, or there are specific proteins that will be required in order for a specific type of molecule to be transported across the membrane. So what are examples of transport proteins that are found in the cell membrane? So the examples of these are channel proteins. We also have the gated channel proteins and the carrier proteins. So what is a channel protein? So a channel protein acts like a pore in the membrane that lets water molecules or small ions move through this quickly. So an example of a channel protein is a water channel protein that is also known as aquaporins. And we also have the ion channel proteins. So from the name itself, this particular type of channel protein, the aquaporin will transport water across the membrane. Water is a polar molecule. We also have the ion channel proteins. So basically, it will transport ions across the membrane. So osmosis is also an example of facilitated diffusion. So many cells contain water channel proteins known as aquaporins that allow water to pass right through them. And without aquaporins, water would diffuse in and out of the cells very slowly. So water, because it is polar, it needs a transport protein in order for it to move across the membrane. And this will be facilitated through aquaporins. So this is an example of an aquaporin, and it is embedded in the cell membrane. It is a type of transport protein. So when we say osmosis, that is the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane. So since osmosis is the movement of water, and water is a polar molecule, so water needs a transport protein in the form of an aquaporin. Another type of a transport protein is the gated channel protein. So this is a type of transport protein that opens a gate, allowing a molecule to pass through the membrane. So from the name itself, this type of channel protein has gate, so as some kind of a gate. Gated channels have a binding site that is specific for a given molecule or ion. A stimulus causes the gate to open or close. So what are examples of gated channel proteins? So examples of these are the sodium gated channels. So of course, this is specific for sodium ions. We also have the glucose. Glucose are moved no, across the membrane through gated channels. So this is the three main types of proteins or ion channels that are found in the these are the ion channels that are found in the membrane. They form pores, channel has to open. So an example of this is the for the ion channel. So example of an ion channel is the voltage gated ion channel. We also have the ligand gated ion channel and the mechanically gated ion channel. So basically for letter A, it is a voltage gated ion channel. So this type of ion channel will open and close depending on the membrane potential. So when we say membrane potential, that refers to the electrochemical gradient that is present in the cell. So yung halimbawa yung ano no, yung electrochemical gradient or electrical charge that is present in the membrane. So for example, when there is when the cell will be depolarized, due to the movement of due to the movement of, for example, cations from the inside to the outside of the cell. So this will cause the increase in the voltage of the membrane. So it will, for example, cause the opening of this type of channels. And these are again facilitated through the voltage of the membrane. Another type is the ligand-gated ion channel. So this will open via specific regulatory molecules. So for example, a regulatory molecule will bind to a site in the channel. So this will cause the opening of that particular channel to cause the movement of these molecules across the membrane. For the mechanically gated ion channels, these are regulated through interactions with subcellular proteins. So for example, there are specific proteins that are present in the membrane that are near this particular channel. So when these proteins will be activated, so it can cause the opening or closing of the channel. So another type of molecule that is being transported by way of facilitated diffusion is the glucose transport or glucose. So glucose enters the cells by facilitated diffusion. Glucose will be transported across the membrane via the GLUT transporters. So GLUT transporters or GLUT transporters. So these are thought to be involved in sodium-independent facilitated diffusion of glucose into the cells. So insulin stimulates glucose transport by promoting translocation of intracellular vesicles that contain the GLUT4 and GLUT1 glucose transporters to the plasma membrane. So this effect is considered to be reversible. So one of the function of the hormone insulin is to facilitate the uptake of glucose molecules towards the cell. So for example, in the liver, we have a certain type of protein, a carrier protein known as the GLUT4. This is present in the liver, and in the presence of insulin, this particular molecule will open in order for the glucose to enter the cell. So how glucose enters a cell? So there are specific transporters that are present in the cell membrane in order for the glucose to be transported from the outside to the inside of the cell. So in this case, we have here the glucose, which is present on the outside of the cell. And it can enter the cell when there is already a higher concentration of glucose that is present in the cell. So for example, after a meal, so halimbawa after a meal or after lunch, the blood glucose level will increase. No? So this will facilitate the secretion of the hormone insulin. So when insulin will be secreted, it will promote the formation of these carrier proteins known as glucose transporter or GLUT transporters in the plasma membrane. So when these GLUT transporters are present, it will facilitate now the transport protein has a binding site for glucose that is open to the outside of the cell. The glucose now will bind to the binding site of the glucose transporter, and this binding will cause the protein to change shape, exposing the glucose to the inside of the cell. So the glucose will now be transported to the inside of the cell, and the glucose will pass into the cell, and the protein returns to its original shape. So as long as there is a higher concentration of glucose in the blood plasma outside the cell, so these glucose transporters will also be present in order to facilitate the transport of glucose from the outside to the inside of the cell. So this type of transport, membrane transport, is facilitated with diffusion because the main driving force is the concentration gradient, meaning a higher to lower concentration of the molecule. So in this case, there is a high level of glucose outside the cell and a low level of glucose inside the cell. Another reason why this is an example of facilitated diffusion is that it requires the presence of transport proteins, but it does not require the expenditure of energy. So again, glucose is a polar molecule, so it needs transport proteins in order for it to be moved from the outside to the inside of the cell. So we also have a carrier protein that is present that is specific for ion. So a transport protein that is specific for an ion, molecule, or group of substances. They carry the ion or molecule across the membrane by changing shape after the binding of the ion or molecule. So carrier proteins are involved in passive and active transport. So we have here an example of a carrier protein. We have here the protein channel. And we also have here the different types of carrier proteins. So these carrier proteins will now transport molecules, polar molecules, or a group of substances from the inside to the outside of the cell. So in facilitated diffusion, so there is a movement of particles from higher to lower concentration using a protein molecule. So this is an example of facilitated diffusion by way of our channel proteins. And we also have here an example of facilitated diffusion that is made possible by the presence of carrier protein in the membrane. So the difference between the two is that for the channel proteins, so usually the molecules will readily pass through the channel, the channel protein until the equilibrium in the concentration of the molecule will be achieved. For the carrier protein, so as you can see here, there is the change in the shape of the molecule or the protein in order to accommodate the entry or the exit of the molecule across the membrane until equilibrium will be reached. So for the comparison between simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, so for the simple diffusion, it does not require the presence of a protein or a helper protein. Okay. So the next mechanism whereby molecules are being transported across the membrane is by way of active transport. So this model of drug entry also involves the presence of carrier proteins. So active transport is energy dependent, meaning that it requires energy to transport molecules across the membrane. And this is driven by ATP. Now, ATP is important in order for this particular transport mechanism to be completed. It is capable of moving drugs against a concentration gradient, meaning from a region of lower drug concentration to a region of higher drug concentration. So that is the opposite of the passive, passive transport. Because a passive, the movement of the drug should be from higher to lower. For active naman, this is the opposite, from lower to higher concentration. So carriers may be inhibited by compounds that compete for the same carrier. So this is an example of an active transport mechanism whereby molecules such as minerals, sugar, and most amino acids are being transported. So they move against their concentration gradient, and this particular type of mechanism requires the utilization of energy, in the form of ATP. So under our active transport, we have the endocytosis and exocytosis. So this type of drug delivery transports drugs of extra large size across the cell membrane. So this is also known as bulk transport, because this type of membrane transport will facilitate the delivery or the transport of molecules that are larger, extra large in size. So in endocytosis, this involves the engulfment of a drug molecule by the cell membrane and transport into the cell by squeezing the drug-filled vesicle. So in here, we have here an example of endocytosis. So it engulfs the molecule towards the cell. For exocytosis, that is the opposite. It is used by the cells to secrete many substances by a similar vesicle formation. So it will release molecules to the outside of the cell. So an example of this are neurotransmitters that are stored in the membrane-bound vesicles in the nerve terminal, and they are released by the process of exocytosis. So for example, here in our figure, we have our sympathetic nerve terminal or sympathetic neuron. So within the sympathetic nerve terminal, we have here our secretory vesicles. Ito yung mga bilog-bilog. These secretory vesicles contain the hormone or the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So when this nerve terminal will be stimulated, it will cause the release of these neurotransmitters towards the synaptic cleft. And when the norepinephrine will be released, it will bind to its receptor on the target tissue or the target organ. So this is an example of an exocytosis, whereby the molecules here, the norepinephrine here, will be released to the outside of the cell. So these are the two major types of transport processes across the cell membrane. We have the passive and the active transport. For passive, again, the substances are being moved from higher to lower concentration, so that is a downhill movement of molecules. It does not require the expenditure of energy. There are three types. We have the simple diffusion, facilitated, and the osmosis. For the simple diffusion, this usually involves nonpolar molecules or lipid-soluble molecules. For facilitated diffusion, this usually involves the movement of um, polar molecules and ions. Polar molecules, halimbawa yung mga sugar molecule, yung mga ions, na they are also polar. Osmosis is the movement of water through proteins known as aquaporins. For the active transport, it is the movement of molecule from lower to higher. So it is against the concentration gradient, and it is uphill trend, uphill movement of molecules. The energy in the form of ATP is required, and there are three types. We have the protein assisted. This is also known as the carrier protein, the presence of carrier protein in the membrane. We also have the endo and the exocytosis. So as concluding lecture, so we have here a video presentation about